Now come on, Willie. I know you can do it, boy. I know you can jump this wall. Come on, I believe in you, Willie. You can do it. You can be free. Come on. You can jump it.
Your hunt for good Star Trek podcast content is over. Welcome to Southpaw Deep Space Nine. This is the only show where a veteran Star Trek fan, yours truly, Angel Marti, watches through episode by episode Star Trek Deep Space Nine with my friend Sam, who is new to Trek, but definitely not new to media analysis, having just gotten one of the most popular articles on the awesome Squid Game review, and definitely not new to political discussion. And we analyze the political and cultural messages in every episode, both explicit and subtextual. Sam, how you doing?
I'm good, and I have an announcement to make.
Ooh, this just in. Sam, what's the announcement?
So I just got word that even though we're only a few episodes in, we are already the #1 DS9 podcast for communists who like the Heart Foundation.
Yes, we did it. We did it. We worked so hard to secure that niche, and we did it. Now, next, we just have to dominate the DS9 podcasts who like the rockers. That's our next step.
Baby steps.
We'll get there.
And just to give people who might want to look up that article, it's at The Real News. It's Squid Game and the Long Shadow of American Empire. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes.
It's awesome. I trust you that he talks about Squid Game in a way that like nobody else that on your social media feeds talks about it. Well, without further ado, let's just get straight into our episode this week, which is episode 1x5, Captive Pursuit. Of course, if you're watching it on Paramount Plus, like I am, because I'm fancy, it's episode 6, but we go by the Netflix order for the plebeians. So, we open on a Dabo girl complaining to Cisco that as soon as she started her job, Quark immediately made sexual advances to her as soon as she started working. And his defense was that Quark said it's part of the job. Cisco wants to help her, but then they look at her employment agreement, and then it turns out that it is contractually part of the job. This is one of those things where we kind of find out that sexism is very much like codified into Ferengi society, and pretty much all of like the lascivious behaviors that we kind of understand as being implicit, like implicitly encouraged and tacitly encouraged and institutionalized by capitalism, are always very explicitly codified in Ferengi society, like they're in the letter of the law.
I think thus far in our DS9 Trek, this is our first direct mention of sexual harassment and sham contracts, which often can coincide and also be their own thing. Sham contracts is something that a lot of sex workers also have to deal with. And sham contracts is also something that even independent contractors have to deal with. So it was interesting to just open up with this. It made me wonder what was happening at the time.
This episode was first aired on January 30th, 1993. So, 93, we're in the first year of the Clinton presidency. So we're definitely not a stranger to sexual harassment from people in positions of power being part of the national discourse by this point. It is funny to me about this whole conversation, I guess because it's the cold open, that they always end up interrupting or being interrupted when they're about to say the word sex. Like when Cisco looks at the contract and says it's there that you have to order, the Dabago cuts her off. And then when they're about to say it again, Kira interrupts, saying that they've got wormhole sign, which is what I'm calling it because I'm both a Dune and Mystery Science Theater 3000 fan. And then Cisco walks off saying he'll talk to Quark. I do find this funny because it's like there are definitely other episodes of Deep Space Nine that just do say the word sex. But I guess it's just, again, because it's like at the beginning of the episode, they're like, oh, you know, this is before when we actually changed the channels. And people were like, oh, kids might flip across it because it's the beginning of the hour.
But also in the order of things, maybe wormhole is the code word for sex, you know?
Oh, wow. That I didn't even think about that connotation. So we finally get to Ops, and you know, as somebody who has seen the whole series and knows that the show definitely doesn't stay this formulaic, it is always interesting to go back and watch these earlier episodes because they do seem to establish this kind of formula of like Cisco is dealing with non-space related things that seem kind of silly. And then we go to Ops, and the alien du jour appears in front of the station. In this case, it is an unidentified ship that seems to be the first ship to come through the wormhole from the Gamma Quadrant into the Alpha Quadrant. Apparently, mostly ships have been going from the Alpha Quadrant into the Gamma and back.
Now, for me watching this for the first time, the introduction of these new quadrants very much reminds me of new COVID variations, especially in their names. It almost like makes me more afraid of these quadrants.
I know. We've had the Greek alphabet ruined. Like, I'm surprised. I would be surprised if like the whole fraternity and sorority system in colleges keeps like existing very long after this pandemic, considering nobody will want to hear Greek letters ever again.
But they kind of treat it like that though, right? Like it's a new quadrant. It's the Gamma Quadrant. Like, you know, what does that mean?
So it's kind of interesting. They never really like explicitly lay it out like until like maybe one of the later shows. But basically the way they put it out is that, I mean, when they talk about a galactic quadrant, they just mean that looking at like a transverse view, or like, you know, I'm trying to use a more scientific way than saying like from above, since there's no up or down in space. If you're looking at the galaxy from above, for lack of a better word, and you slice it into four pieces, those are the quadrants. The Alpha Quadrant, I may have said this in our first episode, the Alpha Quadrant is where Earth is and where most of the Federation is. The Beta Quadrant is where like a little bit of like the Klingon Empire goes into, but we don't really explore very much of it. I think like the Romulan Empire is kind of slightly in there. But then on the other side of the galaxy, you have the Delta Quadrant and the Gamma Quadrant, and they're, you know, since they're on the other side of the galaxy, they're farther away and more exotic, I guess, because we've never really had a show that explores the Beta Quadrant, and Discovery's already leaving the damn galaxy. So we hail the ship that's coming at Deep Space Nine, which is also damaged. We hail the ship. We find out that unlike the last ship that was damaged coming towards the station, it's not harboring a Bajoran terrorist, but it's some lizard dude. And for some reason, he's very much hesitant to accept help from Deep Space Nine until O'Brien speaks friend and grants passage, much like in Lord of the Rings. It just seems he's oddly soothed by O'Brien just calling him friend, I guess because this guy's used to being called, hey, dickface, or something like that. Because I've never seen somebody so thoroughly disarmed. Although, like, I love O'Brien too, so I would do anything O'Brien told me to do. In fact, Cisco notices this and assigns O'Brien to be the first one to meet him because, according to his words, it's a little less intimidating. O'Brien confirmed, acknowledged, harmless, doughy cuddle bear. And then O'Brien boards the alien ship. It's looking very unfamiliar, and nobody's in it somehow. And then O'Brien, very much like me approaching a stray cat, tries to at this new creature, although not in as many words. Instead, he just says, "Friend, you've got nothing to worry about from me." And here's something that immediately stuck out to me, Sam, and I want to know if it's already stuck out to you. Is that by this point in the show, we already know that that O'Brien has a prejudice against the Cardassians, yet for a similarly reptiloid species who's a completely unknown quantity, he seems very trusting right off the bat and doesn't seem to have any kind of fear about it. I think a worthwhile interpretation of this, that is entirely my own projection and might not be any kind of intention of the writers, is that, you know, O'Brien at heart wants to put that Federation and Starfleet ideal of, you know, ultimate acceptance and diplomacy and lack of prejudice at heart, but his experience with the Cardassians has let him sort of feel like he's justified in having that prejudice. And I think, again, it's useful to take that lesson of, like, even if you have the best intentions, you're never above folly, you know, and even if you think you are perfectly progressive and, you know, have done all the work of unpacking yourself, you're never beyond, you know, being caught in something unwoke, and you have to, like, acknowledge and work on it. So here, like, O'Brien's just a good reminder that, you know, man is always going to be a mass of contradictions.
Dialectical materialism.
You said the secret word. Speaking of secret words screaming at you like on Pee-wee's Playhouse, O'Brien does get, it turns out that this lizard dude has kind of chameleon camouflaging things, and he materializes behind O'Brien, and we get a nice bit of physical comedy because we get a Hanna-Barbera style bonk on the head. And he turns around and says, "You can't sneak up on people. It's an Alpha Quadrant rule," which I find is just a fun thing to say, you know, to somebody you're meeting for the first time. But I, as somebody who, you know, was diagnosed as an adult as being on the autistic spectrum, I get a lot of, like, neurodivergent, you know, and more specifically autistic things from Tosk. Well, spoiler, that's the name we learn. Well, O'Brien asks what his name is, and he says, "I am Tosk," and it doesn't seem to clear up whether that's his personal name or his species name. So Tosk just doesn't seem to care much about social rules. He holds his body kind of weird. You know, he just sort of reacts to everything with just sort of this intense fascination. It's something that I can kind of relate to, especially I have another friend who was diagnosed as being on the spectrum as an adult, and she pointed out to me something about how, like, a lot of, like, autistic and other similarly neurodivergent people hold their arms, like, in weird ways. Like, she said, like, Zorak from Space Ghost, and Tosk does kind of, like, hold his arms out in front of him, kind of like I do. So I was just like, I guess I am Tosk too. What's also funny about this is that there is a common way of explaining what it's like to be autistic to people who are neurotypical, and often it's like, imagine you're an alien on another planet. You know, you don't understand the social customs, like, you have a hard time communicating, and so that there's a great episode of the PBS kids show Arthur that where there's an autistic character and uses that explanation. And so that jumped right into my mind with, like, especially when O'Brien, like, makes a joke at him, and all of he does is just sort of, like, look at him, like, intensely in the face and say, "I understand."
I think there is, like, an unconscious thing amongst writers as well. This idea of, like, this foreigner, this, like, permanent foreigner, or this outlier, or this stranger, right? Which neurodivergent people can fall into, or immigrants, or aliens, right? Literal space aliens can fall into, where in movies, you often have them say, like, "I am whatever," because it is such a trope to have an autistic neurodivergent character just say that. And you often saw that with, like, I don't know, like some movie where they run into Asians for the first time. or some Mongolian conqueror for the first time,
or Tarzan, his first is like me Tarzan.
Yeah, and they will say something like that, right? So I think it is kind of like almost a problematic thing, but they're picking up on something real where it's like, yeah, there is like people in our own lives that are like that, and then they then they project that onto foreigners, like projecting deafness onto foreigners. Like, can you hear me? And it's like, yeah, I can hear you fine, right?
Oh, right.
Right? They project these disabilities onto foreigners.
Yeah, exactly. The American tourist idea that the universal language is just English shouted loudly and slowly.
Yeah. And I think that comes from reading people in their own culture that they want to keep away from them, right? And they exaggerate those characteristics in their minds, right? And then sometimes that shows up in writing, and it can be handled in a very thoughtful way, like in Arthur, or in a not so thoughtful way in other stuff. And I think with DS9 or a lot of space alien shows, the writers are often unconsciously drawing from that, and they don't even recognize it sometimes. So I think you're right. You might be reading onto something.
Right. So on the ship, Tosk sort of greets O'Brien with both fascination and suspicion. I noted here that the actor does do a good job of also sort of emulating the body language of a timid animal, especially his head movement. Because there's this whole scene where O'Brien's like, okay, I can fix your ship, but you got to teach me how to fix it. And that'll take a little while. So let's get you out of here. And like my family has a whole history of like rescuing lots of like stray and feral animals. So it like the whole interaction really does feel like, trying to lure a cat out from under the house with a open can of food. So great job by Scott McDonald. So we finally get Tosk out of the ship, but then as they come through the airlock onto the promenade, we do see something that we haven't seen yet, which is there's sort of a little force field that passes over O'Brien, and O'Brien explains that this is a security force field that notices that O'Brien is carrying a weapon, but knows that O'Brien is authorized to carry it. And then they have a discussion about the fact that O'Brien's carrying a weapon, but that does not mean that he has hostile intent. And O'Brien makes a joke about how he has to protect himself in case he can find someone who can make himself invisible. And again, Tosk sort of is able to process that it is meant as a joke, or at the very least that O'Brien isn't somebody who is going to hurt him, and just goes, I understand. And then just continues returning to the more interesting thing of exploring his new environment.
So at this point, when he's like actually in full regalia, walking around, and you get a good look at him, and Tosk looks very much to me and acts very much to me like an 80s pro wrestler from parts unknown, because you see that he's got these traps, he's got these giant quads,
he's got like the bodysuit.
Yeah, which is skin tight. And then even his behavior, right? Now that I'm bringing up like these wrestlers from parts unknown, which often meant like from the jungle somewhere, right?
Or from like the Orient. Like he moves like the great Kabuki or Tajiri.
Exactly. From those wrestlers who are from parts unknown, they move like in this kind of convulsing, like twitchy way, which now, oddly enough, in movie trope is like how zombies move, right? But like back in the day, zombies didn't move like that. But now like modern zombies are fast and they kind of twitch and convulse. And so it does kind of remind me of like the progenitor of a lot of that, the 80s pro wrestler from parts unknown. And especially at this point and throughout at least most of the episode, you're dealing with the same question that the pro wrestler from parts unknown raises, which is he a heel or a face question? And the audience is trying to unravel it along with his new tag team partner in O'Brien, right? Because sometimes like talent enhancement wrestlers or like sometimes mid-card wrestlers would sometimes be forced by the company to be tag teams. And that's part of the storyline, that they're forced to be together and they're not quite sure about this other guy. One is like the good old American wrestler, but then there's this one who's from parts unknown. And he's like, what's going on here? Is he going to attack me? Like he doesn't even know if he should tag him in or not, right? And it's got that vibe.
O'Brien's like Fit Finley. He can, just team with whoever and just be a good old grizzly, compliment to him.
Yeah. But then just like that, right after you get to know him for a while, the one who could speak English and is familiar with quote unquote the boys in the back, then they're the ones who always has to like explain and defend their weird tag team wrestling partner to everybody. It's like, oh, no. Tosk is okay.
A note to our loyal listeners: if you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, as well as our private chat group on Discord. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
No, it just made me think about, again, like, I'm not to totally make this a pro wrestling podcast, but it just made me think about how Tosk is reptilian, and then specifically with like the great Kabuki and then later the great Muta and Tajiri, this whole thing about like Japanese wrestlers always moving in this like snake-like way and then also like spitting poison. It's like, why did we always think that Japanese people were like reptilian?
Racist stereotypes.
Yeah. So during this whole conversation where O'Brien is sort of guiding Tosk around Deep Space Nine, there's a particular line of dialogue that definitely caught my ear, which was Tosk asks, "What is the station's purpose?" And O'Brien summarizes the entire job of Deep Space Nine as to keep an eye on the wormhole, which I definitely want to pick your brain, Sam, as far as like a political history point of view. To me, like for the Federation to run Deep Space Nine and sort of appoint themselves, I'm sure that like they would explain it in a more subtle way than O'Brien did, but or a more diplomatic way. But just imagine, like, has there ever been a point in history where like a single political entity has tried and like, claim sole custodianship of a throughway that goes across borders? I mean, I guess that's like the US with the Panama Canal, or like I wrote down, like, it's just like imagining if like a single country had tried to claim sole custodianship of the Silk Road.
Well, it did remind me of like the British in China. And especially like the reptilian, like to your point, like the Asiatic manners of Tosk.
Oh, man. Oh, it's all coming together. Yeah. I guess we'll just see if they end up going into any opium dens.
I was going to say if that was the wormhole was going to lead to some opium wars like later on.
Oh, my. Okay. You know what? All I'm going to say is that you just made a bunch of people who have watched the entire show laugh pretty hard right now. I will not say anything, but you definitely guessed. You guessed something. I won't say like how like deep into it, but there is, yeah. Anyway, so back to season 1, episode 6. So we get into like the intrigue when O'Brien, very credulous, very trusting of Tosk. Tosk is acting very childlike. He's acting very just sort of wide-eyed and curious about everything. But he shows him to his quarters, and Tosk, upon O'Brien leaving, immediately uses the computer to sniff out where the weapons are stored on the station. Why does the computer in ordinary civilian quarters even tell him the location? Even if he does mention, the computer does say that it's like restricted to people with a security clearance, but like, why would you even tell him where it is? That's like if I can't look up where Area 51 is. It's not like saying, it's in this area in New Mexico, but you can only go if you have a clearance. There's an amazing level of trust in civilians in the 24th century.
And with our previous conversation about colonialism in China, the UK and China, right? And your points about Asian pro wrestlers, right? But when they first meet in the ship, right? You just know that Tosk is I am Tosk. That is his name. That is his species. That is also his gender, right? I'm saying his because you had a note earlier that we didn't bring up.
Right. O'Brien doesn't ask him his pronouns.
It was assumed, right, that it was a he, right? The reason why I bring this up now to our Asian conversation and about China is because Chinese, prior to British colonialism and British impact, was a non-binary language. It didn't have pronouns. And Korean doesn't either. I'm sure I've read that this is true for a lot of non-Occidental languages. So they had to learn how to gender their languages to communicate with these new like Westerners. And that point that you made unconsciously harkens back to that as well.
Please forgive me, Sam, but as a fluent Chinese speaker, I'm going to be the white guy who actually an Asian person about Asian things. But just to clarify, what you said about Chinese wasn't substantially wrong, but Chinese still has a gender-neutral third-person pronoun. It is only distinguished in gender in writing form. But yes, like that you're right that it was only like the differentiated writing forms were only introduced after foreign intervention. But spoken Chinese still has a completely neutral third-person pronoun, which is very convenient. So Cisco and the ops crew meet with O'Brien again to see what he's sort of figured out about Tosk, and again, ironically, he prefaces his assessment of Tosk with, "You hate to prejudge anyone," and it's like we literally saw you a few episodes back telling Cisco to not trust the Cardassians, like right off the bat. So pot kettle, whatever. But he does suspect that Tosk is on the run from somebody because the damage to his ship is very clearly weapons damage, but he doesn't want to suspect that Tosk himself has any bad intentions because he says I want to like the guy. I guess it's helped me understand that maybe that's part of my charm, is that I'm just so blunt and always just very direct about what I'm interested in and curious in, that people find that charming. So thank you, Tosk, for helping me understand myself. But Cisco says that O'Brien should basically just be his friend, continue to find out more of what he can. And of course, that means taking him to Quarks. During the conversation leading up to that, Tosk reveals that he basically has no concept of rest and relaxation. He only needs about 17 minutes of sleep per rotation, i.e. per day. And he has like some kind of like nutrition system embedded in his skin. But his then conclusion when going into Quarks is that the Alpha Quadrant has far too much downtime. Sam, I have a feeling that you had a reaction to that line.
Like the easy one about like capitalism, when we all have to work ourselves to death, right? But the joke is like, you guys are all lazy, right?
Or at least that's what he thinks.
But I think Tosk, 24 hours a day, he is working. He is always doing something. He cannot rest. There's something about his life where he cannot rest, right?
Yeah, it does lead us to the fact that he has like the stuff implanted under his skin does make us think, why does he have that implanted? What does he do with his life that would require him to like, always be on the move? So actually that's a smarter thing to comment on, I think, than just me going like, Amazon, Jeff Bezos, pissing in bottles.
Actually, that's a good point, right? Pissing in bottles, Amazon too. But it reminded me of those hikers, runners who have those like backpacks or even like the helmets with like water on it, where you just have the straw attached to your mouth, so you don't have to actually like stop to drink. You could just drink while you're walking or you're hiking or you're running, right? It all seemed like it was part of like being constantly on the go, constantly on the run.
That will always be like the most confusing thing to me anytime I'm in some kind of like sports oriented store, when it just sells those like pouches full of like nutritional goop that I guess you're supposed to just like be able to like squeeze into your mouth without stopping running. Like, to me, that's just like, there comes a point where like sports crosses over into just okay, this is me just like abusing my body. But before the running police get after me,
this actually does connect back to capitalism, because for so many Americans now, because they are so on the go, whenever you ask them about breakfast or they're looking for breakfast, they always want something they could drink, right? They're like, is there a shake I could drink, or smoothie, or whatever?
Or Soylent, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Tosk is basically the inventor of Soylent. Did you ever listen to the Dollop episode about Soylent, about like how basically the whole thing was created because he just didn't want to waste time eating anymore?
And a lot of people who work like long hours at their jobs, their breakfast has to be something they could eat in the car or on their way to whatever. So that's why, like in the mornings, shakes, smoothies are becoming the number one like breakfast food for Americans, or a banana. Why? Because unlike other fruits, you could hold it in your hand, peel it, doesn't make a mess, and then you just throw away the peel. It has to be something like that you could hold in your hand and eat on the go, right? So that shows you how like what was supposed to be for athletes who are running for them to eat has become American breakfast, right? Because Americans just are overworked, right? They're just working long hours.
So Quark talks to Tosk, trying to figure out what he can convince him to enjoy in his bar, and then Tosk, with like a genuine sense of apology in his voice, goes, "I'm sorry, I have no vices for you to exploit." And now, in light of what we just discussed, that just makes me think about how there's all those like articles that are just about like, there's too much life in the work-life balance now. And like Tosk here is clearly engineered to be the ideal worker, whatever his job is, because he just does not need to have a life, and he doesn't know how. He is alienated from any life outside of his job.
He is an alienated alien.
Double alien. It's alien squared. Alienated alien. That sounds like a name of a punk band.
Here, Quark reminds us once again, the holosuite is the nookie room.
When Quark tries to pitch the holosuite as like a room of like thrill and romance and adventure, Tosk responds, "I have no need for fantasy adventure. I live the greatest adventure one could ever desire." And to me, that really sounds like a hip young Mormon trying to turn the conversation he's having into like about Jesus. It's just like, I live the greatest adventure ever. I'm living for the Lord. But unlike a Mormon who wants to talk with you about what he's doing in great detail, when O'Brien tries to ask him what this adventure is, Tosk says he cannot discuss it.
Well, if Christianity was so great, you'd want to keep that to yourself if you really think about it.
Yeah, no. Why are you trying to give it away to me if you like it so much? This much sucks.
Yeah, what's the deal here? Why is it saying it's free? What's the strings here?
Have you heard the good news? Says the ad on Craigslist. That's about as much as O'Brien can get out of him. And he goes back, reports to Sisko. And again, this is where he says he kind of likes the guy, which, I just hope people feel that way about me after like they first meet me and I'm just like asking if they want to hear about Gigantopithecus or something. Have you heard about Gigantopithecus, Sam? It's an extinct gigantic orangutan that we've been able to reconstruct only from jaw fragments. It's one of my little pet pieces of knowledge. Hi, welcome to being friends with an autistic person. But speaking of Gigantopithecus, a giant mystery here is, what is Tosk running from? And so we see a little bit more entrapment here because Tosk starts poking around on a computer, probably the one where the weapons are stored that he was looking up earlier. And then Odo, fucking goo cop, was disguised as a painting and then catches Tosk. But Odo does what most cops can't do in real life, and that's deal peacefully with a neurodivergent person. And in fact, he does not even lay a finger on him. I mean, probably it helps that, he's able to just trap him in with force fields. But I have this written down later, but I just think it's useful to bring up here that Odo is basically like the mythical good cop that liberals think exists, but doesn't. Like, whenever they try to like invoke like a hypothetical cop that doesn't abuse his power, like that's basically what Odo is.
A shapeshifter. It's about as likely as a shapeshifter.
Yep. So Sisko, after Tosk is taken to a holding cell, Sisko tries to ask more about this adventure because clearly he wants to get into Jesus, but Tosk tells him that he cannot discuss it, and O'Brien is able to deduce that he was trying to break into some weapons, and Odo asks him if he's ever committed a crime, and then Tosk responds, "Never. I am Tosk, and I am Groot."
There you go. See?
Yeah. So we learn. So what we can gather from here is that Tosk is trying to arm himself, but he's clearly not a bad guy. And then Sisko again just Cisco's been really good at like doing this sort of mysterious, always playing the long game kind of thing in this episode in particular. So he's like decides to sort of bait a trap. He says, hold Tosk in the brig and see if anyone comes looking for him.
And there's questions about Gamma Quadrant, and they're talking about this is the first person from Gamma Quadrant, which really does solidify that idea that the Gamma Quadrant in this, at least this episode, is the parts unknown where this mysterious wrestler has appeared from.
Where Colonel Tom Parker went voyaging in the jungles of the Gamma Quadrant.
Uh-huh. And with Kim Chi.
I know, but I was thinking, I was just thinking, like, you know how Colonel Tom Parker, like, when Harlem Heat was first introduced, they literally came out in chains. Like,
Man.
They quickly nixed that because they fucking realized why. But I just imagine it's like in chains, you have like Booker T, Stevie Ray, and Tosk.
That could have been an actual gimmick. That's how bad it was back in the day.
Oh, that would have been like mid-90s WCW, like when they were doing like RoboCop and shit. Like, definitely RoboCop like comes in to rescue Tosk. Absolutely.
While in WWE or WWF at the time, you had a masked manager named Kim Chi bringing out Kamala with a leash around his neck.
Yeah. No, the Sultan, and just like then Al Snow playing Avatar, and was it Savio Vega playing Quang the Mongolian ninja? Just
there you go.
History loves Asian people, you know. We've been very kind to them and very respectful. You know, you love to see it. So O'Brien takes a moment to after Cisco and Goo Cop leave the holding cell to try and get some more info out of him, like just being like, come on, you got to tell me what's going on so I can help you. Because, you know, O'Brien loved Tosk and Sloth loved Chunk. But the only further little thing we get is that Tosk is ready to die with honor, and that he needs to be let out of the cell so he can die with honor. So again, something's fucking going down, but I think we as the audience, and I, you know, am able to sympathize with O'Brien, realizing that Tosk is definitely not the problematic person in this case, because he's just trying to protect himself. But then we have wormhole sign again. It's another unknown ship. They say that the ship matches Tosk's signature. But then these new, also unknown aliens, they scan the station, fire a beam that disrupts the entire station's shields. This is a ship that can disable a station shield. They must be some serious, like, you know, threatening, scary motherfuckers, right? But no, they beam onto the promenade and they all look like Mega Man.
The Hunter outfits are some of the goofiest I've seen in all of Star Trek. Does it get worse from here, or is this known as some of the worst among even DS9 fans as well?
It gets better. Paul, oh my God, I just called you Paul.
That's the long defunct co-host.
Yeah, no, I was, after talking about Asian racism, I just confuse you with another Asian guy just to drive the point home. No, but Sam, it does get better. It does get better, Sam, especially because, you know, like as all Star Trek shows progress, you know, they get, if they prove themselves successful, they get a bigger budget, they get better production design. So no, you're right that, you know, some of the aliens, especially in season 1, do, and especially these ones, like these aliens look like some kind of like public domain clip art you would use to like advertise laser tag.
Okay.
They're not their species isn't even given a name, like in this episode. And then on Memory Alpha, they're just called the Hunters, but I'm just going to call them the Mega Men. I mean, and it's too bad they look so silly because, you know, they do then proceed to wreak some havoc on the promenade. One of them knocks Odo out with a punch before he can goo his way out of it. And then there's a big firefight. They have like this wrist armor that can block phaser fire. It's just like, if they didn't look like some kind of generic PC game character that like comes preloaded on your Windows 95 desktop, like they would be pretty badass.
Now, why doesn't Odo use a phaser?
Again, he's the mythical good cop. He doesn't need a weapon, you know? It's like he has his goo powers so he can subdue people without, you know, it's like we just have to like understand that this is just Odo is like the fulfillment of that liberal fantasy that there can be policing under capitalism where cops just, need sensitivity training or de-escalation training and they won't shoot people. I mean,
well, actually, even going back to the Western framework, there is that whole Western / kung fu movie, like genre, right? Where there's like the martial arts guy becomes the sheriff of the Western town. And he's like, I don't use guns. I use kicks and kung fu, except Odo doesn't know how to do that either. But
it's just like, I can become a sofa and you can lie down on me and talk to me about your problems. So one of the Mega Men charges up his Mega Blaster and busts open the brig, where there seem to be no other prisoners at the very least, which I like to say, at least, again, if we're doing the headcanon, projection of how the Federation works, we can sort of say that it's like, it's like China where there are police, but there's some kind of like, there's no longer the bourgeois class character to the police, and they don't use policing and incarceration as sort of a default. So at the very least, while there's still problems with the role that Odo fills, it's not like he's like throwing everybody and anybody in the brig. But chances are that probably is also because they had a low budget and couldn't hire other actors to put on alien suits.
If you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. It'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, and you'll be giving us some breathing room, not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
But so we see that there's this whole chase, the firefight, and then Mega Man has a laser that can see through Toss camouflage. He just sees that he's in this he's in this really good fighting stance though. Hips low, back straight, nice arching of the crotch. Like I for some reason that's like, I mean, I guess the reason being that we're both martial artists. That was the first thing that when Toss reveals himself inside the holding cell, I'm like, ooh, that's like, he's like in a Silhouette stance. Like it's a good stance.
And it also reminded me of like those 80s posters where wrestlers would pose for the photo, right? And they would do that same pose, especially like those mysterious, quote unquote jungle wrestlers.
Yeah, great kabuki. Again, yeah. Man, everything's wrestling.
But then they're fighting Mega Men, so that's kind of weird.
It's like, well, you know how like in those NES games there would always be like, especially like Kirby and Mega Man, there would be like one like wrestling powered, like a wrestling based villain where like you swallow him and then you get like suplex power. Like that would be the great kabuki in like a Mega Man game. WrestleMan. So here's where things get interesting, because so the Mega Men finally catch Tosk, but he seems disappointed that he sees Tosk alive and in this holding cell. And he, the lead Mega Man, reports back to the other Mega Men that he has him alive. And then the others immediately beam off the station. And then Mega Man Prime takes off his helmet to reveal that he's actually Whiz Pig from Diddy Kong Racing, if you remember that game. Again, they don't give the species a name, so I'm just calling him whatever I want. So we finally get this sort of like revelation of the whole scenario here, because the lead Yellow Piggy says that Toss Race was conquered, and they are bred specifically as hunting game to be set loose and hunted. And they are also sworn to an oath of silence about the truth of their existence. So we also learned that Tosk is not just the name of the individual, but the name of their entire race. And Sam, I've been waiting all episode to say this. Hey, Sam, do you know why they have to keep breeding so many Tosk?
No, why?
So they can multitask.
I see.
I'm so proud of myself for that. So, of course, Cisco, seeing that, a sentient being is being used as chattel for prize hunting, is rightfully disgusted and incensed. And but Piggy says that he's going to give Toss the greatest humiliation, which is to bring him home captured and alive so he can be put on display for children to make fun of him. And I just can't help but think that it's a good thing that Tosk doesn't live on 21st century Earth, where we put ourselves voluntarily on TikTok when we want to be made fun of by children.
It's true.
So here's where we have another great Cisco pulling somebody into the office and yelling at somebody. And I just realized that, like, if I were gay, and the jury might still be out on that. I mean, whatever. I'm only 33. I have plenty of time to explore, but I would have such a daddy kink for the stern, I'm about to tell you in very precise terms how many new assholes I'm going to tear you, Cisco. Like, he just tells Piggy Dude, like, exactly, why this shit's wrong and how he's not going to, let Tosk go, just in this very, and there's just so much of a commanding authority that comes off to him that it's like, I can't describe it other than a level of command that crosses over into the erotic. Sam, let me know when my horny is bothering you too much. I know there's like already enough horny with Bashir on this show.
Yeah, Bashir has been a bad influence on you.
Yeah, I've been infected with the Bashir miasma. It is infectious. Like early at the beginning of the episode, I forgot to mention that, like, so Tosk runs into Bashir, who's of course talking up some hot lady, and then like later on he ends up like Tosk ends up ogling some Bolian woman walking out of Quarks, and I'm like, you've caught the Bashir horns.
But now we're getting to some more of the political meat of this, right? Now we're dealing directly with gladiatorial enslavement and chattel slavery, lack of personhood. But this can also be read as an episode about toxic masculinity, or even an allegory for patriarchy if we connect this to the first scene about sexual harassment. So there's a lot of ways to read this, but it is very much about lack of consent, or very much about
how patriarchy traps people into certain roles, because it's like the Dabo girl is contractually trapped into her role as victim, and it's like, so, and Tosk is culturally bound, and by nurture and environment bound into his role as prey, and there basically is this argument between the lead Piggy and Cisco, which this is where we get like to me, like, a lot of people agree that this episode's a very classic Trek episode. And to me, what marks it as such is having like the classic Trek scene formula that goes like, yes, my people had something backwards like your people have now, but that was back in the backwards and barbaric 20th century, not now. We're better now. Because you're right, you brought up some things that were definitely part of human history. And Cisco's like, we don't do that anymore because we realized it was wrong.
I mean, ultimately, I think this episode, the meat of the politics, is about conquest. And there's two parts to conquest historically also, which is imperial conquest, which you see with Tosk, but also sexual conquest, which you see with the person who works for Quark, who does Dabo, what is Dabo anyway?
Oh, Dabo is just like, it's basically space roulette. They never really explain the rules of it. I mean, just like they don't explain Pi Show on Avatar. It's just like, this is a space game that we play just so that way they're not just playing bingo, but there's always like the spinning of a wheel. So it's probably something like roulette.
So this element of conquest, right, imperial and sexual, is still lingering in Asia today, is still lingering, and something I talked about in my Squid Game article, which is it's lingering in Korea, Japan, all throughout Asia. It didn't become like this sexual tourism hub out of nowhere. It was forced upon by conquest by the West, and also by Japan too. But Japan was getting direct aid from the West up until a certain point. You go back and even up until the attack on Pearl Harbor, and they became enemies, quote unquote, right? I like to say frenemies.
Yeah.
Because prior to that, with Japan conquering Korea, that was agreed upon and okayed by the U.S. under the Taft-Katsura Agreement. And then the U.S. is the one who traded with them to get them all their steel, to get them industrialized. And then Japan took all of our rice and gave it not only to Japan, sold it to the U.S. So they wanted that. The U.S. wanted that, right? And even why I say frenemies is because even before the war ended, they invited Japan to the Bretton Woods Agreement to figure out how capitalism was going to work, and everybody was going to be under the U.S. dollar/gold standard.
it seems very easy to set up that analysis because, like, to me, when I think of these kinds of like organized recreational big game hunts, I think of the British. Like, to me, that just feels like a very specifically like British kind of, pastime, release the hounds. And that seems to very much like be, what these hunter aliens are like. And then, so while Cisco's like trying to argue with lead Whizpig about the whole concept of the hunt, they sort of pull out the human nature argument. There's like, the animals are bred to be killed. They like fulfilling their promise. They don't know anything else. As we see from Tosk, because he's been so fully alienated from any other kind of way to live his life, he like doesn't understand how to be anything other than the victim of the hunt.
He's conditioned and colonized, right? He's internally colonized. He's been conditioned. This is all he knows.
Earlier, you bring up dialectical materialism, and I'm in the middle of reading Dialectical Materialism: An Introduction by Maurice Cornforth. And one of the things that it starts out as it's introducing dialectical materialism versus idealist forms of thinking is that the whole idea of sentient beings, like specifically the whole, like when people talk about, communism goes against human nature, that the very idea of there being an innate, abstract, immutable human nature is like in and of itself an undialectical argument because, all organisms are influenced by their conditions and vice versa. So it would make sense that the hunters would sort of appeal to this abstract, immutable nature of the Tosk species, without even like allowing for the possibility that if they change their conditions, they could live differently and know something else. Because, that idealism and an undialectical way of thinking is the only way that they can justify their exploitation of other sentient people.
Yeah, I think even like writers and thinkers like Aimé Césaire has talked about like how problematic humanism can even be because it was thought about like by these Westerners, these Western conquerors. So to them, they're like, well, it's just human nature. It's like, yeah, but you got to decide what human nature is, right? I don't agree with your definition.
I know this is only episode 5, but like we've reached a nice peak of like actual specific philosophical citations in this episode. Good job, us.
Because you need the pro wrestling to get there.
Yes. All roads lead through pro wrestling towards dialectical materialism.
Of course, of course.
As we're sort of heading into the home stretch here. So Cisco, as a short-term solution, decides to release Tosk in exchange for the hunter piggies, the Whizpigs, officially setting DS9 as like out of bounds for the hunt. And then he also cites the Prime Directive, that old chestnut about how like, because the hunting is like part of their culture, like, the Federation has no room to dictate to them, what is correct and what is right. And of course, O'Brien, because, sloth love chunk, protests. But I like this. I really like this because they pull the possible workaround here that Tosk could ask for asylum, but they have to convince Tosk to ask for it. Because we saw the asylum thing pulled a couple of episodes ago. But when O'Brien asked Tosk, if he wants to request asylum, he refuses because he just thinks that his whole life is meant to seek an honorable death in the hunt and that he cannot deny his existence as Tosk. Which I just love that they were like, oh, what if we just did the solution from a previous episode, but then they show that it doesn't work here. I mean, I know it's not like very heavy-handed, but I enjoy that they're just like, oh, it's not just going to be the same, solution every single day. It's not just going to be, this Superman always just flying in and punching the villain as the way it ends. It's like, we're going to have to try different possible results here. So O'Brien realizes what's going to happen and sort of goes to drown his sorrows in synthale in Quark's. And Quark notices that O'Brien's not in a good headspace. And at first he thinks that it's O'Brien having trouble with my wife. I also like that Quark remarks specifically, your face gets very pink when aggravated, because it's nice to like hear somebody say something weird about white people's skin, because we don't get that a lot. But so they sort of have a little bit of a back and forth, and O'Brien's sort of like really fed up with the fact that the Federation has to play by its own rules, such as, the Prime Directive, and then the whole, like, the Hunters have their own rules, and Tosk is basically caught up in these two opposing sets of rules. And he remarks to Quark that I guess the Ferengi really like rules, so they would have specific rules about this kind of situation as well. And Quark is saying that rules are open to interpretation, and O'Brien has a eureka moment where he realizes he can just change the rules. And so finally we get the resolution here is that O'Brien concocts a maverick scheme where, as they're about to let the piggies walk off with Tosk, he walks up to the whole like retinue of people, and number one, gets rid of Goo Cop by saying he has orders from Cisco to replace him as escort, which again references, like, in the previous episodes, Odo has already had a lot of like chafing against Cisco's orders and directions. So again, nice continuity established right up top. Then after he gets rid of Goo Cop, he's playing on the piggies' obsession with cultural protocol by saying that it's Starfleet's cultural sign of respect to give them a personal escort off the station instead of simply letting them beam off. And then he throws off his comm badge to let him know that to let us all know that he's going off the grid.
Going back to the Western, it's the sheriff putting down his badge to break the law, right?
Yeah, you're right. The badge iconography.
You got to break the law to do what's right? Like sometimes the laws are unjust.
Exactly. And so what happens is he walks them through the same airlock that he walked Tosk into in Act 1, and then Chekhov's gun fires, and the security force field sees that the piggy guard has weapons and gives him a shock. And then O'Brien gives him a nice Irish potato in the face, punches him, knocks him out, and now the hunt has resumed, and Tosk can die honorably someday. And so now we've got a bit of a Die Hard situation where actually it's kind of an E.T. situation.
Exactly.
O'Brien is Elliot helping E.T. run away from the FBI.
Yes.
Or it's like Free Willy. In fact, this has definitely become like one of those like children's movies where it's like the kid has to help like the captive alien or animal reach freedom.
Jump to freedom, because there is a point where Tosk finally leaps over O'Brien like Free Willy into freedom.
Yes, if anybody here is good with video editing and can get us a video of Tosk doing his magnificent pounce while the Michael Jackson song from Free Willy plays over it, I'll give you a kiss or something. I don't know.
Hey, we have fans now. We're number one.
We are number one.
We have 5 fans.
Yes. So here's where we start to see Cisco also wanting to play the rule-breaking game, because he notices that Tosk has escaped, that O'Brien's with him, and Odo's about to run off and capture them. And then he just goes, Chief, there's no need to worry. We then get a nice climactic episode, a moment where Tosk says, now you are Tosk as well, O'Brien. And it reminded me of the end of the first Guardians of the Galaxy, where Groot like wipes away Rocket's tear and goes, we are Groot. Like finally acceptance. So we finally get Tosk. Tosk is able to escape, and he can hopefully die with honor someday.
Probably 2 days later.
Yeah. But I just think we get a good moment here where O'Brien is like, given the threat that if he disobeys orders directly like that again, he might get reassigned. But, O'Brien says like, hey, like, why didn't you, like, I was pretty certain I was going to get caught by Goo Cop. Like, what happened? And Cisco's like, oh, I guess that let us slip by. So I guess if like you asked like, a writer at the time, like, what's the most like saccharine way you can, describe the moral lesson of this episode, you'd be like, it's like Martin Luther King when he said that an unjust law is meant to be broken. All right. Well, before we wrap up, are there any other thoughts you want to share about this particular episode?
No, I think we're good.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for our discussion of Captive Pursuit. Definitely join us next time. We are going to be watching Season 1, Episode 6, Q-less, where an old friend from the next generation comes and visits. Tell your friends, share with all of your, share with your fellow Star Trek fans, share it with your fellow commies, share it with your mom. I don't care. Share and obsess over it, in your favorite Star Trek Facebook groups. And also, please listen to the other shows on the Southpaw Network. We've got Pride Never Die. We've got Working Stiff Radio. We've got Fight Study. There's something for everyone.
It's like DS9.
Yes.
Something for everyone, right?
So what part of Deep Space Nine is this show? We're the Hollow Suite because we're the sexiest part.
Yeah. We're the Nookie Room.
Yes. I love your description of it. God.